All right, so I want to look at Jude 1, verses 5 through 8. This passage has always kind of been a mystery to me, and I think it has been for others as well. In this passage, we see some pretty wild stuff about angels, about Sodom and Gomorrah, and some other things. And if we read through this quickly, it's easy to miss a lot of things that are being said here. But as I've done a very deep dive on this passage, it's become pretty obvious to me that what Jude is doing here is actually giving a very structured warning to the early church, to the local church, and presumably to other local churches, as he probably anticipated his letter being spread. But it's a warning about the dangers of these false teachers who had infiltrated the local church and probably other churches as well. And he explains that these false teachers, the message that they were spreading was turning the gospel of grace into an excuse for sensual and immoral living. And then Jude explains a little bit more about what they were teaching once we get to verse 5, which is where we will start in this lesson. What I see here also is that Jude is actually explaining that these false teachers are using the examples of past rebellious activity that occurred between angels and humans. And these false teachers were using the accounts of this activity to develop this unbiblical teaching in order to justify sensual and sexually immoral behavior. And to explain this, we see Jude using historical and supernatural examples. He refers back to the mysterious book of Enoch, which we'll talk about. He looks back to something that happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's a lot more here. But as we look at this, I think it should become clear that all of these stories and accounts they're not disconnected warnings or random warnings or random illustrations. They're all connected. They're all related. And the way they're related is by explaining the consequences of crossing God's established boundaries. And in this passage, in Jude's case, this boundary is the boundary of sexual conduct and spiritual authority. And very specifically, the context here is the boundaries between angels and humans, but of course this applies in general as well. All right, so let's take a deep dive here. We'll look at the Greek, we'll look at the literary structure, and we will try to break this down so that we can see exactly what Jude is saying. We'll see that Jude is actually connecting behaviors that we see in Genesis 6 and 19, and we'll see a major theme that Jude is explaining, which is the inevitable judgment of God that comes upon those who persist in rebelling against God's established boundaries. All right, so let's take a look. Let's start here with verse 5. I'll just read it. It says, "Now I want to remind you, although you came to know all these things once and for all, that Jesus saved a people out of Egypt and later destroyed those who did not believe." So as we start here, Jude he begins by reminding the readers of a truth that they already know. And that truth is that God's judgment falls upon even those who have received a great privilege, as Israel did, if they respond with unbelief. If they respond with persistent unbelief, then God's judgment upon that is inevitable. Jude reminds the audience how the Lord saved Israel, the people of Israel, out of Egypt, but later destroyed those who believed. The Greek here for remind meaning cause to remember, and his use of the perfect participle once for all indicates that Jude assumes that his audience was already aware of these truths. So this is a reminder. And it means that he's not teaching them new information, but he's calling attention to the consequences of persistent rebellion and unbelief by bringing up this prominent reminder, which he will then later, in the next verses, he will continue to develop. And this sets the stage for Jude's pattern, which he will be using to develop his letter, the warnings that he's given, which again is that privilege from God, no matter how supernatural, no matter how extraordinary they are, if those privileges and extraordinary blessings are responded to with defiance, persistent defiance, instead of a faithful submission, a faithful surrender, then there is no guarantee of protection from God's judgment. Not because, and that's not to promote anything such as conditional salvation. That's not what's going on here. What Jude is referring to are people that never truly surrendered, never truly submitted in faith. And what Jude is explaining is that even these people, these types of people, which can also experience amazing privileges from God, those privileges do not guarantee protection from God's judgment if for those that are outside of faith, of trusting in God by faith. So that is the foundation. This is the foundation of what Jude will be talking about. All right, so let's go to verse 6. Verse 6 says, "And the angels who did not keep their own position, but abandoned their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains in deep darkness for the judgment on the great day." So here in verse 6, Jude starts with his second example. He explains that there were these angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but they left their proper dwelling. Now the Greek term here for position of authority, which is arche, this is significant, or it's important because these weren't regular angels. These were angels with positions of authority. They had a certain sphere of rule or principality, a higher responsibility. Jude also uses a rare form of the word for dwelling. This word appears only once in Jude and once in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 2, which refers to a heavenly or spiritual habitation. So what this verse is saying, what Jude is saying here, is that these particular angels who held higher positions of authority in heaven abandoned their divinely assigned spiritual status. They abandoned the spiritual dwelling where they held higher positions of authority in heaven. They abandoned this status or this dwelling in order to pursue something that God had forbidden them from doing. So this is an important piece of the puzzle to understand Jude here. Now he continues by saying that God has kept them in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Now here, Jude doesn't use the more common word for eternal, aionios, which refers specifically to a duration of time. He uses a less frequent term, idios, which has carries a little bit more significance in terms of the permanence or unchangeable nature of their state, meaning that the imprisonment for these rebellious angels is not just for a long time, but it is an imperishable, completely unalterable state. It is a very severe punishment and judgment for these angels. All right, now let's talk about something very important here, which is the very probable, if almost certain, connection to Genesis chapter 6 that Jude has in his mind. Now, most biblical scholars, and I agree with them, they interpret the dwelling that the angels left as the spiritual state in heaven, their higher authoritative positions in heaven, which I just mentioned. But as to the nature of their rebellion, I agree that this rebellion is specifically documented in Genesis chapter 6, where it says that the sons of God cohabited with the daughters of man. And this is when these angels, these rebellious angels, left the dwelling of their heavenly realm out of a disobedient, rebellious desire to engage in immoral behavior with humans. And so this would mean that the angels' rebellion was not just about pride or authority. It was also more specifically involved a desire to experience physical, carnal existence on earth, which was a violation of what God created them to do, a violation of their created purpose, which of course we see other scriptures talk about this a lot regarding humans. But of course, it wasn't any different with angels. There were specific purposes that God created angels to fulfill. And just as humans, angels were not permitted to step outside or live outside of those created purposes. And because of that rebellion, God has put these angels in chains until the great day of judgment. Now let's talk some more about how we know that Jude, actually let me back up. let's talk more about how we know that Genesis 6 is referring to angels. Now, the main clue lies in the Hebrew phrase, B'nai Elohim. And this phrase actually provides us the most compelling linguistic evidence. We see this particular Hebrew construction elsewhere besides Genesis 6. We see it several times in Job. In Job 1 verse 6, chapter 2 verse 1, and 38 verse 7. And this is where we get our biggest clues, because in each of these usages, the contextual meaning of this phrase can be nothing except that, or it can mean nothing or refer to nothing except that of angels or heavenly beings. And so from this context, we know that this phrase, this Hebrew phrase, establishes or helps us to know that the phrase B'nai Elohim refers specifically to angelic beings instead of humans. Now, we also get more clues from other related Hebrew phrases. For example, the phrase Bar Elohim, which appears in which appears in Daniel 3, verse 25, it describes the fourth figure in the fiery furnace. And it's quite clear from the passage that it is referring to an angelic being. We also see the phrase Bar Elim in Psalm chapter 29 verse 1 and chapter 89 verse 6. And here the phrase Bar Elim also refers explicitly to angels. And so when we put all of these, when we put B'nai Elohim and its related phrases and related contexts, it's a very strong, if not certain, case that each of these phrases provide contextual evidence that the phrase sons of God, B'nai Elohim, refers to heavenly beings rather than humans. So just to give you one explicit example, Job chapter 1 verse 6 says, "The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." And so when you consider the context here, you have sort of this heavenly council where the sons of God are among Satan. They're presenting themselves before the Lord, right? So this has to refer to this heavenly council. It has to be heavenly beings that are presenting themselves before the Lord, not humans, right? And we see the same thing in Job chapter 2, verse 1 as well. And so again, there is this strong, by virtue of correlation here, this strong clue or understanding that Genesis 6 is also referring to heavenly beings, the same as Job. So now that we've kind of covered what Jude has in the back of his mind as he wrote this, and how his knowledge, which was, by the way, the traditional understanding of what happened or what was going on in Genesis 6. Let's continue to let's go back to our passage in Jude, with all these things in mind, and let's look at verse 7, where he uses the incident of Sodom and Gomorrah as part of his warning. So let me just read that. Verse 7, it says, "Likewise, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns committed sexual immorality and perversions, and serve as an example by undergoing the punishment of eternal fire." So here Jude is talking about what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, and as well as the surrounding cities. This is a clear reference to Genesis 19, the events that are described in Genesis 19. What Jude is doing here, if you notice in verse 7, the very first word he uses is likewise. And this is a crucial word because since it means in the same way, he's explicitly connecting the sin of verse 7 of this verse to the sin that he's describing or alluding to in verse 6. And so Jude is drawing a parallel between the two types of sins. In other words, both the angels and the men of Sodom were guilty of crossing boundaries between humans and angels, boundaries that were established by God. So in other words, in verse 6, he's talking about how angels left their dwelling, their appointed dwelling, and crossed a boundary to have relations with humans. In verse 6, connected to the events of Genesis 6. Then in verse 7, now he's describing the events of what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, the events of which are described in Genesis 19. So verse 6 is angels crossing the boundary to have relations with humans. Verse 7 is humans crossing the boundary to have relations with angels, right? So it's the same sin, but in reverse, if that makes sense. So a couple of comments about this verse. Jude uses, or we see this phrase, strange flesh. It refers to an other or a different flesh. And Jude is apparently referring to the angelic nature of Lot's visitors in Genesis 19. So it means that the men of Sodom were seeking sexual relations with angels who, in Genesis 19, appeared in human form. And by the way, a lot of versions don't actually translate into the English strange flesh or other flesh, but that is literally what it means. If you look at Young's literal translation, it says that they have gone after other flesh, or it literally means strange flesh. I'm looking at the ESV here. ESV, for some reason, translates it as unnatural desire, which is an interesting choice of translation because that's actually, it's somewhat far off of what it actually says, because the word is literally flesh. The Greek is heteros sarx. It literally translates to strange flesh. So I'm not sure why the ESV made that translation choice. But anyway, in the Greek, it says that they pursued strange flesh, which is actually quite important to understand what Jude is saying. So, all right. So, but let's move on. So, going kind of back to the connections between the verses that we've covered, what we see across in these verses 6 and 7 and then 8, we see something called a chiastic structure, and this is actually one of the frameworks, or one of the ways that we actually see the structure of what Jude is doing here. A chiastic structure is a literary device where a sequence of ideas is presented, or an idea or a statement is made, and then in successive statements, that idea is then stated in the reverse order. So in this case, we have in verse 6, as I said, angels pursuing human flesh. Then in verse 7, we have humans pursuing angelic flesh. So if the first phrase is A, then B is humans pursuing angelic flesh. So B is the reverse of A, right? So, and then in verse 8, which we'll cover here shortly in just a minute, we have the false teachers are seeking to defile their flesh just like the angels did, or they're seeking the same sort of corruption and defilement, right? Because they're tied up in some way. They are wanting to partake of this same across this same boundary that God has forbidden. So let's move on to verse 8. In verse 8, Jude here he breaks down the pattern of the false teachers' rebellion. And so let's just read that, verse 8. It says, "In the same way, these people," meaning the false teachers, "relying on their dreams, defile their flesh, reject authority, and slander glorious ones." There's actually some important translation choices here that need to be commented on, because it's actually important to fully understand what Jude is saying. What I just read is the CSB. Let me read the KJV, because I'm going to point out something that's important regarding these dreams. The KJV actually says this. It says, "Likewise also these filthy dreamers defile the flesh, despise dominion, and speak evil of dignities." And the reason this is important, the description of their dreams as being filthy dreams, is because these aren't, in the Greek, it's clear that Jude is not talking about a regular kind of dream that, a sort of weird but natural dream that we have no control over when we're asleep. That's in our day, when we say dream, that's what we think of. But that's not what Jude is talking about. This is more like a daydream that these false teachers are having. It's more like a fantasy. If you look in the lexicon, the actual Greek word means to be beguiled with sensual images and carried away to an impious course of conduct. In other words, Jude is saying that these men are fantasizing. They are having fantasy daydreams that they are conjuring up in their own minds. This is not uncontrollable dreams, but these are for lack of a better term, sexually charged fantasies, where they are daydreaming about this experience of crossing over this boundary between angels and humans. And then Jude goes on to say that in doing this, they are defiling the flesh. They defile the flesh, which reinforces even further the sexual nature of their sin. So they are polluting or defiling their flesh. That's a very important aspect because since their sin is sexually immoral in nature, it has a very polluting nature to it. All right, something else in this verse that is really important to understand is exactly what authority they are rejecting. And this is a little bit hard to see unless you look at the Greek. What it actually says, what authority they're actually addressing or rejecting is the authority of heavenly beings. They are not regarding with reverence or respect the divine radiance or majesty of heavenly beings. And we know this is the case because the word that Jude uses for glorious ones, or the KJV translates it as dignities. Let me see what the KJV translates it as: blaspheme the glorious ones. The Greek word here is doxa. And this word always refers to angelic beings. So they're not rejecting, he's not talking about their rejection of earthly authorities, although they certainly were. But in this specific context, Jude is talking specifically about their rejection and their disregard for heavenly beings, their total and complete lack of reverence. And we'll see why this is the case actually in verse 9, where Jude compares the respect and reverence that the archangel Michael had for the devil in a dispute that they had about the body of Moses, where Jude says that the archangel Michael, who, if anyone had the right to be disrespectful, had the right to be disrespectful to the devil. However, even the archangel Michael would not disrespect and be irreverent toward the devil, while on the other hand, these false teachers, who certainly had no place or right or prominence to be so disrespectful and irreverent regarding angelic beings. So when you take this context as a whole, it's very clear, as well as the Greek, but it's very clear that Jude is talking about their lack of reverence and fear and respect for heavenly beings or heavenly authorities. Now, something else about the nature of their behavior. In verse 8, Jude is using the present participle forms of their actions: defiling the flesh, rejecting authority, blaspheming heavenly beings. He is speaking of them as ongoing, habitual behaviors. And so this is also very important. These aren't false teachers who are kind of falling into error and then catching themselves and admitting that that they have made errors, or they're not checking themselves for errors. They are habitually and rebelliously committed to all of these behaviors. It is an ongoing habitual behavior, which again falls in line with all that Jude has been saying about the inevitability of God's judgment. Remember, we talked about how Jude is making very clear that habitual, ongoing rejection and rebellion against God's boundaries, against the order that he has set, and just direct habitual disobedience will inevitably result in his judgment. So he is continuing to establish this theme. And so just to wrap this up, as we've talked about, Jude is establishing a very clear principle, if you want to call it a theological principle, that God's judgment is impartial to and inescapable to those who live in a state of complete habitual rebellion of the boundaries he has set. Even the privileged Israelites, the glorious exalted angels, or the great cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, all of these experienced great favor and blessing from God, but because of their rebellion, their complete practice of disbelief and lack of surrender to God's natural order, and their rebellious defiance and desire to seek out what God has forbidden, regardless of their privilege, leads them to the inevitable judgment and destruction of God. And that is really the main point that Jude is trying to make here to his audience. Now, just a very quick conclusion here. So we've talked about the fact that these different examples, these historical examples, are not random, disconnected events, but they are very connected, specifically used examples to illustrate the rebellious behavior of boundary crossing between angels and humans, which God has forbidden and condemned, and that the false teachers had somehow become fascinated by and infatuated with, were having these sort of fantasy daydreams about, and that just like the humans and angels who indulged themselves in this behavior, the false teachers will inevitably also experience the inevitable judgment of God. Now, it's worth mentioning in closing that even though Jude is, in this case, specifically focusing on sexual immorality and the crossing of boundaries regarding sexual immorality, we can also take a more general application of this to understand that any kind of boundary crossing, any kind of rebellion against the natural order of things that God has established will result in the judgment, the punishment of God. And that's something to understand, that God sets the parameters, God sets the order of things, and he expects us to follow them, and we should follow them because it's what's best for us. God knows what's best for us, and it is within those boundaries that we find true fulfillment. We find true purpose, and remaining faithful in those boundaries. And so Jude's letter here is actually quite pertinent, not only with regard to the specific topic of sexual immorality that he's dealing with, but also just in general. It is a timeless call to be vigilant and faithful as we experience the constant temptation and the constant occurrence of others who seek to rebel against, to disobey what God has established as the proper boundaries. So this letter really stands as an example, as an exhortation to the integrity of the Christian faith, and it's a great letter for a lot of reasons, and that's certainly one of them. All right, now that wraps this up, and I hope this was helpful. Bye now.